In January of 2022, I made the big leap and moved from London, England to Saskatchewan in Canada. In this video, I'm going to tell you 5 things that you need to consider before making the move to Canada. So grab a Tim's and join me on this journey. So number 1 is getting your credentials recognized, and this is something that can be quite tough depending on where you are within the country, what province you're in, also what you did in your home country too. For example, I was a teacher back in England, and getting my credentials recognized in Saskatchewan, or at least my teaching credentials, was something that was not an easy process and actually took about a year and 8 months. Something I was not expecting when I initially moved to Canada. I actually applied early. I applied about 3 months before I moved to Canada. However, I then had to do some extra classes, which then took a long time to get done. Now, if I would have known that in advance, I would have tried to have got that ball rolling before I even moved to Canada, but I guess for me, I wrongly assumed I would have met the requirements even after doing some research. So one thing I would really recommend, depending on where you're moving to, is looking at how credentials are going to be assessed with what field you're in the area that you are from. Often this is going to be based on the province that you're working in, but it's something to really consider because this can also make you think about where you move in Canada. Thinking about my example, I could have gone to somewhere like PEI and I likely would have been able to work much more quickly than what I did while in Saskatchewan. Now, that doesn't mean I regret living in Saskatchewan. In fact, I love it and make lots of videos about it. However, it's something to really consider when you are making that move to Canada. So that leads me on to number 2. So number 2, getting a job can be pretty challenging within Canada, especially if you're in those big cities. And although a lot of my examples are based in Saskatchewan, this is very similar across all of Canada. One thing I would really recommend before you move to Canada is look at what jobs are available in different cities. Thinking about myself as a teacher, if I went to a city like Toronto or Vancouver, then actually getting to be able to do the job that I did in the UK would take that much longer because finding a job would not be easy. And don't get me wrong, even where I live in Saskatchewan, finding a job is not an easy thing. However, it's much more possible because I strategically kind of chose where I lived. I say strategic, I actually moved here because my partner was from here, so not really strategic, but it did really help in my favor. And I know that if I was in those bigger cities like Calgary, Toronto, Vancouver, I would have found getting a job much more difficult. But actually, by being in Saskatchewan, I'm able to really get that Canadian experience. But again, that's going to depend on what job you do and where the demand is. For example, if you're in healthcare, that's going to look completely different to whether you're in education like myself. But something to really consider is what jobs you want to do, what jobs you currently do, and how that is going to transfer over to Canada. Because in most cases it likely will, but you may need to do some additional research, and again in some cases you might need to do some additional education as well. Something just to quickly add there as well, in my experience, finding jobs isn't always as hard, but finding those full-time permanent positions with benefits is something that just can be a little bit more challenging. So when you move, you want to really consider what kind of jobs you want. Are you looking for something that's more short-term, or are you looking for something that is more long-term? And you may not have that luxury, especially when you first move here. So number 3 is the tax. And this is something where I think it's pretty well known that when you come to Canada, you will pay for the product and then the tax goes on at the end once you have brought it. That doesn't mean it's not confusing, and even for myself, I don't think I fully know how much tax I'm paying before I get to that point. Especially for me now using card all the time, I just have my card, and it just makes it a little bit more confusing, and something I do wish is that the tax was included in the price just to make my life a little bit easier when I'm budgeting and things like that. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this at all. However, if you're not used to it, it's just something that will just take a little bit of adjusting, and I've been here now a year and a half and I'm still adjusting to that, and that is okay. So that leads me on to number 4, which is Canadian cities. And don't get me wrong, Canadian cities are pretty sweet depending on wherever you go. With that said, one thing to really consider is how expensive Canadian cities are. And even for myself, I wrongly assumed that living in Canada would be cheaper than living in the UK. But actually, I would say it's pretty on par in the majority of places, especially in those bigger cities. For example, if you're thinking about cities like Toronto or Vancouver, that's pretty much on par with London in terms of cost of living. Now, there's a reason for that. People want to live there, there's a lot to do, and they're wonderful places to be. However, they're still pretty expensive, just like many other cities around the world. And if you're like me and you kind of wrongly assumed that actually living in Canada would be cheaper than living in the UK, well, I was pretty wrong. So finally, that leads me on to number 5, which is traveling around Canada. Now, Canada is such a huge country. In fact, it's the second biggest country by landmass. Now, that means traveling around Canada is something that is really difficult and really challenging to do in practice, just because of the sheer size of the country. For example, I live in Saskatchewan, and the only provinces I've actually been to since moving here is Alberta and British Columbia. Now, there's so many more places I want to see, like Newfoundland and Labrador, PEI, for example, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia. There's just so many more parts of this wonderful country that I want to see. However, it's really difficult to do that because everything is so far away. Something I mentioned before in previous videos is if you want to take other modes of transportation rather than driving, so for example things like flying or even getting a train, well, that's going to set you back a lot of money, so something to really consider there. I looked at flying from Saskatoon to Toronto and it was $500. Now, that's not always the case, but compared to living in Europe, actually the cost is just so much higher. And I guess there's a good and bad thing about that, but the downside for me is there's so much more of Canada I want to see, which I just haven't been able to do there. So there we have it. There were 5 very quick things you need to consider before making the move to Canada. So if you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you give the video a thumbs up, and if you're new to the channel, feel free to consider subscribing. But most importantly, I want to hear from you. So this was very quick, so if you've moved to Canada, or if you're thinking of moving to Canada, is there anything else that you think you should consider? And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. So that was it from me. My name is Jack. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all soon. Bye for now. Take care.